Putin believes very strongly in the existence of the US deep state. And in that respect, he's got something in common with Donald Trump. So I think from the Russian perspective, they have to ask themselves, is this sustainable? Are the Trump people going to be able to see it through? What point might they get real blowback? Could Trump be seriously weakened in next year's midterm elections? Could things move against him in Congress? Quite possibly.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by John Lough, the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. John, thanks very much for joining us again.
Thank you, Louis. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you on. Well, we've heard Donald Trump accuse President Zelensky of not reading the latest US proposal for peace with Russia. What do we know about these new proposals?
We know very little about them. Both sides are keeping these under wraps for the moment. I think the leaking of the 28-point plan probably caused more confusion and distress than was intended. Although it seems the Russians leaked it, whether they did that with the Americans' consent, we simply don't know. But I think there's a real effort here to try to keep this negotiating process very tight. And obviously they're dealing with issues now which are extremely sensitive. And for the Ukrainians, these concern, first and foremost, the issue of territory, and secondly, of potential security guarantees. And thirdly, related to that, is the issue of the size of the Ukrainian army and what sort of armaments, in fact, might be allowed to have. So I think all those issues they want to keep out of the public domain for now, to see if it's possible with the Russians to find some sort of common ground or possibly even a trade-off. And of course, the Ukrainian fear is that they are simply going to be compelled into some sort of quasi-surrender that will be then dressed up, as a Trump peace victory.
And is there any common ground that we've heard yet on which we can realistically expect a peace deal to be built? I mean, there were a lot of red lines, especially on those issues of territory, how much of the Donbass Russia wants. There doesn't seem to have been any signals, do there, of shifting on those red lines that we've heard?
Well, I would say, first of all, the probably big change of recent months is the United States has made it very clear there's not going to be any further NATO enlargement. The issue of Ukraine's accession to the NATO alliance is off the table. And for the Russians, that is a key objective delivered. But in terms of the shape of Ukraine in future, where the borders will lie, what sort of army Ukraine will have, and that's related then to the relations it will have with its Western allies, whether limits might be put on those. These are things that are obviously still up for debate. So the Russians are playing this, I would say, extremely cautiously. Putin continues to think that time is on his side, that he just has to advance a little bit more on the battlefield. He has to attack, more critical energy infrastructure and inflict misery on probably millions of Ukrainians. And at some point, the country is just going to decide it's no longer worth fighting this war. And added to that, and I think this is something, in fact, he has in common with President Trump, he believes that it's time for Zelensky to go. And Putin has recently returned to this formula that Zelensky is not a legitimately elected president, of course, because his presidential term has expired. But because of martial law in Ukraine, it's not possible currently to hold elections. And those elections can only take place when the war has come to an end. And martial law has then been lifted. So from his perspective, he wants to, it's definitely one of his war objectives to get rid of Zelensky. I think the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky has been able to stand up to Putin, the courage he's shown is, if you like, a powerful example potentially to others in the region. I mean, this is no doubt a very plucky man. And it's said that Trump doesn't actually dislike him, but he's irritated by his inflexibility. So I do think this latest statement from Trump that trying to almost drive a wedge between Zelensky's negotiating team that's been out in Florida speaking to Messrs. Witkoff and Kushner, and Zelensky himself saying that Zelensky hasn't even bothered to read the plan and he's still against it. I mean, firstly, I don't believe it's true that he's not acquainted with the the latest draft and the latest discussions, because his negotiating team is going to remain in very, very close touch with him. And the chief negotiator out there is none other than the chairman of the National Security and Defence Council. So he's immediately answerable to the president. So that simply can't be the case. But I think Trump is frustrated by the fact that the Ukrainians are not showing a greater willingness to compromise effectively on Russian terms, but brokered by the Americans. And he's probably trying to see, is Zelensky possibly vulnerable, some sort of power challenge? Is it correct what Putin's been telling him, namely that the Ukrainians want to bring the war to an end, and it's Zelensky and his team who are the obstacle? I mean, that's clearly not the case. There's still, I think, very strong support in Ukraine for continuing this war in order not to have to surrender territory. I tend to think the Ukrainians will actually fight for those regions of Donbass that Putin wants at the moment, even if they conclude that, okay, they'll lose them in 6 months' time, but they'd rather lose them having fought for them than simply surrender them.
And can we look back for a moment and just see what might have shaped this new secret proposal? There have been several kind of deals and bases for talks that have been agreed by different parties from the White House. Do we think this new deal is one that's sort of been struck by Marco Rubio, or is this something Witkoff's team have created? Because it was them that it was Witkoff that last spoke to Ukrainians, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I mean, it feels as though it's sort of marriage of the Russian objections to the 21-point plan, I think it was, that Witkoff and Kushner took to Moscow last week, plus probably some input from Marco Rubio, maybe his back stiffened a bit by the Europeans, and then of course the Ukrainian commentary on just how those proposals can be really converted into reality. And I think the brutal trade-off ultimately for the Ukrainians is, can they give up some of that territory that they believe they should otherwise fight for in return for some meaningful security guarantees? And I think that's the only way a deal can be delivered. And then we get into this cycle of the fact that to provide security guarantees, the Americans need to give a backstop to the Europeans, because the Europeans are not prepared to do it on their own, at least not so far. And it's very hard to see how they would be. And yet the United States doesn't want to be in that position. It's quite happy to be the sort of diplomatic lead here in bringing this war to an end. But this war is not going to stop, I think, without some firm result of that kind, where the Western allies, and even if the US is a disengaged ally at this point, say, look, we do understand there's a danger if Ukraine stops fighting now, accepts largely, let's say, Russian conditions, including some restriction on the size of its army, that if it does that, there's simply a risk the Russians will come again in 4 or 5 years' time, just as they did ultimately after the start of this war in 2014. They annexed Crimea in 2014, and yet the big war, full-scale war, began 8 years later.
And meanwhile, while this has been going on, Zelensky has been meeting with European leaders in London, Germany's Friedrich Merz, France's Macron, and of course, Britain's Keir Starmer. What can they do at this point to support Ukraine, do you think?
I think that they can still be a channel of communication to Washington, however much Washington wants to deal directly with both Russia and Ukraine. They simply can't ignore the fact that the way this war ends is going to have very major consequences for European security in general, in which the United States still has a stake. And that's very clear from this national security strategy published last Friday, which I hesitate to say is, in my view, not a strategy at all. It's something more like a sort of political manifesto. But it does make the point that strategically, Europe is still a very important theatre for the United States, in which it intends to remain engaged. However, it sees the burden of responsibility for defence lying on the shoulders of the Europeans. So for now, it sees its goal as ending the war in Ukraine, preventing the possible expansion of this war into a Russo-European war, and the restoration of strategic stability between Russia and the US. So some of that is not, of course, illogical, because there is a danger that this war could expand. And the fact that arms control arrangements between the US and Russia as major nuclear powers are in very poor shape, there's work to be done to restore those relationships. So, not all of this is completely off the wall. I think the problem with it is the way policy is being executed, because there is no policy-making process, supported by a well-trained policy apparatus that you would normally expect to be involved in these sort of negotiations. I mean, that's the reason why we have, skilled diplomats and analysts and all that sort of body of people. But the difficulty is that President Trump and those people around him greatly distrust those structures in the US government and are doing their utmost to bypass them. So effectively, the State Department has been frozen out. We know that Russia analysts, the National Security Council, what's now called the Department of War, I suspect probably also the CIA and the intelligence world, that these people in some cases have lost their jobs or they've had to move to alternative positions, that body of expertise is no longer being drawn on for its wisdom and its input into what would be a traditional policymaking process. So in other words, you've got people who are very experienced in the arts of diplomacy and lack the deep knowledge of the region, who are leading this effort. And it's striking to see two individuals, Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who their background is as real estate developers. And it doesn't mean to say they're not skillful negotiators in their domain, but dealing with a war on this scale, with the amount of history and the complexity that lies behind it, this is not their core strength. And I think that partially explains why they're getting into difficulty. And while President Trump seems to be still in a great hurry to achieve some sort of deal, the danger is that the deal he might insist on at some point and try to ram down Ukrainian throats is simply not going to stick.
And as you say, John, this new US national security strategy, it's very politicized, and it's got a pretty stark message for Europe, claiming that Europe faces civilizational erasure. There's two sides to this, really. I mean, how tricky is it going to be for Europe to navigate this level of political impetus behind the US security strategy? And on the other side, can it really see it as being a consistent strategy when something this political could really change by the next US election or the one after that? I mean, how can you build long-term plans on this?
Well, I suppose the answer is you can't. And in the defense and security business, it's wonderful to have stability, and that's why it's so important to have some sort of national consensus around defense. But in this case, we can see, I mean, this is revolutionary, what the Trump administration is bringing to foreign policy, particularly its view of both Russia and Europe. But I suppose the irony here is that in the strategy, the Americans say that Europe's lost its self-confidence. It has plenty of hard power and should be able to manage Russia on its own. I mean, I think there is some truth in that Europe has not had sufficient measure of self-confidence to be guided by, its convictions, because it's so used to depending on the United States ultimately for this delivery of hard power. But by talking about Europe in this very dismissive way, it's demoralizing for European leaders, and I think that further undermines, if you like, the self-confidence. So perhaps possibly the Americans are hoping this is sort of going to galvanize the Europeans into action. And that meeting today of President Zelensky with Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, I mean, that's a sign to me that, there is like a core of countries in Europe that are going to probably try as best they can to take the lead here. But of course, the institutional mechanisms are not really there. So the European Union is too large and I think too diverse and simply too split on this particular issue of Ukraine to be able to really manage that process. So it's going to come down to what we call colloquially the coalition of the willing, and within that so-called coalition, I think it's going to be a subset of the countries that are really prepared to put their shoulder to the wheel and still have some muscle that they can contribute.
Yeah, and the Kremlin has been pretty complimentary today about this security strategy document. But there's a lot of warm words. But is this attempt at a US reset with Russia any more likely to succeed than the last 4 attempts at resetting relations with Russia?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that the people in the Kremlin just cannot hide their glee at this document. I mean, it just could have been drafted in Moscow and put out there as probably some prototype of what the ideal version of US foreign policy would be in many respects. So I mean, I think they must be saying to themselves that this is just too good to be true. There's something that doesn't feel quite right here. And as I don't tire of saying to people that Vladimir Putin believes very strongly in the existence of the US deep state. And in that respect, he's got something in common with Donald Trump. So I think from the Russian perspective, they have to ask themselves, is this sustainable? Are the Trump people going to be able to see it through? What point might they get real blowback? Could Trump be seriously weakened in next year's midterm elections? Could things move against him in Congress? Quite possibly. But what we do pick up is that within the Trump electorate itself, particularly in the sort of Bible Belt states, that there's just a lot of dissatisfaction with the fact that he talks a great game, but people don't feel the economic benefit of it. So could he get into trouble with his own electorate? Well, again, I'm not an expert on US politics, but I think looking at it from a Russian perspective, you'd have to say that's a risk. So the Russians probably sense that they can, make hay while the sun shines. And I think they're definitely looking here to Trump to put pressure on the Ukrainians to bring this war to an end effectively on something close to Russian terms. So this is going to be the first big test of what he can really deliver. But equally, I think they'll be struck by some of the obvious contradictions in this document. The fact that the US is so dismissive about Europe, yet sees a role for itself in Europe, sees itself committed in certain ways to helping Europe build up its capacity to be a strategic player, to manage its relationship with Russia. So the US hasn't gone yet. At the same time, I think the Russians see that Trump and those around him are attracted by commercial deals and will do everything to try to sustain this impression that there is a fortune to be made by developing Russian natural resources, only a question of Americans coming back into the Russian market, trying to deploy probably those frozen assets that Europe wants to use to support Ukraine for some sort of US-Russia development fund. I mean, this was in the original 28-point so-called peace plan. So I think they're holding out, that sort of bounty for the US side, hoping they'll sort of really bite on that and believe that because they're starting a business relationship, everything else is going to fall into place. Which, if you think about it, is also, it wasn't so long ago that the Germans and others believed that, at a height of tension, a time of great tension, this was after the annexation of Crimea, the stabilization of eastern Ukraine in 2014, the Germans thought this was a good time, in fact, to expand their gas relationship with the Russians. And this idea that Russian ambitions could be tempered by business deals, and it was really a quite lucrative prospect for the Russian national gas company Gazprom to be supplying more volumes of gas directly to the European market. It didn't stop in any way Putin from embarking on this war. So could the Americans be lulled again into this sort of false sense of security that they've normalized the relationship with Russia? when in actual fact, Russia is pursuing its goals by other means, and this is a way of sort of neutralizing American influence, possibly in Europe.
And I'm interested in the picture that has kind of been painted there in the way this shapes up. I mean, what I'm interpreting from this, John, is that Ukraine, in their eyes, as we know, are pretty keen to see Putin's regime collapse. Inversely, the Kremlin then seems to fear that the Trump administration could collapse, and at the same time, Trump would quite like to see Zelensky gone, perhaps. Does the US have the skill to unpick that situation and create peace there, do you think? Do they have the diplomats to square that circle?
I don't see them at the moment. I think the policy process is just too deeply flawed to make it happen. There are, of course, these sort of black swan, scenarios out there. One is that Putin slips on a banana skin tomorrow, which I have to say is very unlikely. The second is the Russian economy is going to get into great difficulty, and I really don't see any way that's going to happen. I mean, it's certainly hurting as a result of Western sanctions, the excessive investment in defense. We can see high inflation, we can see tax rises, we can see other symptoms of problems that are going to stall Russian growth as a dependency on China. But the economy is not going to fall over, and there are too many Western leaders at the moment who seem to think that, we just had this last round of sanctions, that's going to push the Russians over the edge. It's simply not. It's not going to happen. And by the same token, it doesn't look as much as Putin wants to believe that Ukraine is going to fall to pieces. This country continues to show unbelievable levels of resilience and courage. And although it is definitely running short of soldiers, which is a longer term worry, on the front lines, because the Russians have a significant numerical superiority there, it still feels that they can sustain this war of attrition for a good while, provided that they're getting from the European allies, they're getting weaponry and ammunition and other forms of support. But the really critical issue here, I think, for Ukraine is just the state finances. The country is going to run out of money in April next year unless it gets significant help from the European allies. And this is where the question of the frozen Russian sovereign assets in Europe, where it becomes a very critical issue. It's almost sort of litmus test, I think, of Europe's resolve. But overall, I'm still really very dubious about the ability of the Trump administration to bring this war to an end. And when I say end, they might get a peace deal, but it doesn't mean the war will end. And it's not so unusual for peace agreements to come unstuck if at least one side feels that it's an unjust peace. So I think that's the danger. This could be a war that smolders for many, many years if it's not properly fixed.
A sort of Minsk 2, 3, and 5 and 6 and so on and so on. If you take my meaning, well, just finally on that new security document. I mean, JD Vance and Pete Hegseth have been in Europe using this language before. Europe in decline, America withdrawing. We've discussed here that this could all just be ideological talk, but how close does this document put Russia to sort of successfully achieving that aim of detaching the US from European security infrastructure?
I suspect it makes them feel very confident that they're on that path, and it's just a matter of time before the US takes these sort of longer term decisions that might relate to the number of military bases it keeps in Europe, the number of troops it keeps on the ground, these sort of things where you see a kind of material result after the proclamation of the goal that Europe needs to invest more in defense and manage the security of the continent more independently. So that's probably going to take some years. So they have to reckon with the fact that Donald Trump has 3 more years in the White House. Is he going to be a lame duck president in a year's time? And if he is, does he probably try to derive power or relevance from choosing his successor? I mean, could this be, another long drawn out form of The Apprentice? and he's deciding between the different options. So I think that's probably the game that's in play, and maybe for the Russians that's an unsettling one, because they can't be 100% sure that these policies being outlined now are actually going to stick, and they're going to be converted into outcomes that are measurable and indeed lasting. So I think they've got a good long way to go. Overall, I suspect their suspicion of what they perceive as a deep state in the United States is going to temper some of their current celebrations. But I think they're most definitely in celebratory mood right now. But they haven't got they haven't got good reason, I think, to celebrate their position in Ukraine, because in a sense one can say that the Ukrainians have been slowly losing this war probably for the last 2 years. I don't think you can say at the same time, paradoxically, that Russia has been winning the war. It's in this situation where it should be doing much better. It may ultimately do much better simply because Ukraine is the weaker of the two parties when you look at their resources. But it all comes down to ultimately how you fight the war, and whether the Ukrainians are in fact putting up just sufficient barriers to slow the Russians down to ultimately exhaust them. We know that Russia is still having to recruit 25,000 soldiers a month to put them into battle, because that's the number they're losing. It is becoming more expensive to recruit these soldiers, and the quality of the soldiers in many cases is very low. And we're talking about be it ex-prisoners, people apparently fighting even in their 50s, and they're not capable of conducting, by any measure, sophisticated warfare. So that's why the Russians are not doing better. And as one commentator said to me recently, somebody who analyzes deeply the so-called Z communities, Telegram channels. So these are the sort of patriots and supporters of the war, at least probably 95% of them. This person told me, a Russian analyst told me, the overall impression from reading all these posts and watching the videos was that the Russian army doesn't really want to win this war, because the major generals, the brigade generals responsible for this operation on the ground, are quite comfortable with a war of attrition because they're making money out of it. They don't have to take excessive risks. They can just continually bring people into battle, use them as cannon fodder, and the system kind of works. So I think there's a big question there about whether the Russian army will really be able to punch through. And possibly a sign of their perhaps the frustration in the Kremlin, or indeed even desperation, is the fact they're resorting to such a wide-scale air campaign targeting critical infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure in Ukraine. That's an indication that they're actually not doing so well on the battlefield, much as they would like to create the impression that a whole string of towns are about to fall and the Ukrainian army is in chaos and the front is going to collapse. I don't see any sign of that right now.
Well, John Lough, the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can also sign up for a membership where you'll get exclusive content and access to videos earlier than you would otherwise. And remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can read The Times at thetimes.com, or you can listen to Times Radio. And if you want to hear more from Frontline, you can also hear us in podcast form. Just look for Times Radio's Frontline wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Goodbye.